topic I was presenting on today was on examining 21st century migration from Africa to Europe. My paper particularly focuses on those migrations that are unsafe, if I may say. So people are using unsafe modes of transport. What are the human rights implications of those migrants in transit? Good governance must be promoted. Good governance must not only look at processes, but also look at deliverables. Intra-African migration is actually more as compared to outward migration out of the continent. According to the program, my topic was examining 21st century mass migration from Africa to Europe. But I've removed the mass because that's research. When you do research, you tend to twitch and change a bit. So it's not, I will explain why I removed mass from it. So migration is when a group of people move from one territory to another. It's an ancient phenomenon. You find it in early Christian writings as well as the Quran. I make reference to these two religions because they are the most practiced religions in Africa. So you find that important figures in both the religions were refugees at some point in time. In my paper, I also make it a point to define certain words. They're called word clusters, if I may say. So you have migrant, immigrant, refugee, and asylum seeker. One of the few things that I noted right at the bottom was that they are what we call economic migrants. Definitely. What about economic refugees? Are they people who flee economic crisis from their home countries to move to a different country? So that's a question that I pose, and I also ask whether or not they are not equally deserving of international protection under international law. So sub-Saharan Africa, I look at sub-Saharan Africa, predominantly sub-Saharan Africa. The migration patterns are characterized by outward migration from the continent as well as intra-African migration patterns. So 53% of international migration, which is crossing of an international border, is actually within the African continent, while the remaining 47% is out of the continent. So intra-African migration is actually greater than Africa to Europe migration, contrary to the reports in international media, particularly Western media, even though it's not significant. So you have 47%, and of the 47%, we're looking at migration to the US, migration to Europe, as well as Asia and Australia. So my focus, again, was on Europe. So although migration patterns, Africa to Europe, is not significant to the extent that it can change the demographics in Europe, it's still important for us to discuss why are people moving anyway, and why is there seemingly so much desperation to cross the Mediterranean to go to Europe. And in the paper, of course, there is nuance. I do make mention that not all people who go to Europe use the boat. So and not all people who go to Europe are going to look for a job. Some are just going for education. I got these statistics from the Pew Research Center. It notes Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya as the countries that stand out for sub-Saharan migrants living in both the US and Europe. But what I find interesting is there's always reference to migrants who are already in Europe. What about the migrants who are in transit? Where is their protection? Where is their protection? Can the law develop to encompass them and protect them thereafter? the migration patterns to Europe are not as Western media may portray it. But it's still nevertheless important because it perhaps gives us a chance to look at what are the underlying issues as to why people are moving. So there are different reasons, but what stands out for me and the direction that I was taking for this paper is poverty and poor standards of living. The socio-economic well-being, we are talking about access to clean water, healthcare services, education. And these are basically human rights concerns, and they tie together with what we term social and economic rights. So Europe is generally seen as a place that one can take refuge from these socio-economic wars. So migrating is seen as an opportunity. But in the paper, I also note that there's war and conflict that sometimes make people migrate. And then human rights violations, election violations, and so forth. So with regards to human rights violation, the last point there, it's mostly civil and political rights, and which is something that I still think is a problem in the discourse of human rights. The classification and the distinction between civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. In my opinion, the two must be viewed as equal because they reinforce each other, they are interdependent, and so if one doesn't have access to clean water or health care, it really, puts them in a position that manipulates, for them to be manipulated in a way that undermines their civil and political rights. So you find people are migrating. When you're migrating, when you're in transit, what's happening? There are human rights abuses. People are vulnerable. Sometimes they can be vulnerable to slavery and servitude. And even the human right to life, there is a serious assault to the human right to life on those migrants who are still in transit. So if a boat capsizes, what happens? People die. And that is actually an assault to the human right to life. Moreover, like I said, human rights are interdependent. So you have the slave trade in Libya as one example, right, of what's happening in terms of migrants in transit. So where's the freedom from slavery, servitude, and where is the human right to dignity in that regard? And then you have health concerns and healthcare concerns of those migrants in transit. But that's a socio-economic right. Adequate housing. Where are these people staying? Women's rights, particularly reproductive rights. Can women really can they really enjoy their reproductive rights when they're in transit, when migrating to Europe? I suppose not. So the status quo currently, in my view, undermines the AU Agenda 2063. So then it brings me to what is really the issue. And there are several issues, and again, in my humble opinion, it comes down to governance. So it's a multi-layered issue. There are so many things going on, but what else is going on? What is at the core? And in my opinion, it's an issue of governance. So governance is defined as a process of governing undertaken by government through laws and norms, or a process of decision-making and the process by which decisions are implemented. I have a problem with that United Nations definition because sometimes it often neglects that good governance must also be about the deliverables. So the processes may be correct, but what are the deliverables? And then I also note good governance as perhaps an issue, but what is good governance? It has many tenets below it: participatory, consensus-oriented, accountability, transparency, responsiveness, effective and efficient, equitable, and inclusive, among other things. And the state is the primary actor when a government is being regarded as a government that has been, that has good governance. Then we have the civil society. They basically act as a check and balance. And then we've got economic governance. People are not fleeing war and conflict. Sometimes people they just want a better life, and that really comes down to the economy. So economic governance is another area that I touch on. So if most sub-Saharan African countries prioritize good governance, economic governance, and well-functioning economies, migration and its dire consequences on human rights could be limited or otherwise avoided. Who are the key stakeholders? I note the state because, in my opinion, everything begins with the state. The state as there to guarantee human rights, all human rights, civil and political as well as socio-economic, because they are supposed to be equal. So there's been arguments for good governance to be a fundamental human right. This was by a former constitutional court justice from India. And what my thesis actually says is that a well-functioning economy should actually be a human right. Apex, because it should be at the top. Arguments are, of course, how can you say an economy is more important than the right to life? Yeah, I suppose not. But yeah, maybe it's time to think of it in that way. And then immigration control, Agenda 2063, it's quite exhaustive. So its realization depends on the state to commit resources, commit to making and implementing laws to advance that agenda. Then there are other stakeholders such as international or regional actors, for example, the African Union, the civil society, but most of all, perhaps, political will is where we have a problem, because the law seems to be robust. I mean, we have an exhaustive human rights law framework under the auspices of the African Union, but we are still in this position. Thank you. My name is Nyasha Noreen Katsenga. I am a student. That's number one. I'm a student at the University of the Western Cape. I am studying towards a Doctor of Law. Apart from that, I'm also an assistant lecturer, a graduate assistant lecturer. I assist in lecturing and delivering of content in constitutional law. The topic I was presenting on today was on examining 21st century migration from Africa to Europe. And I looked at it from a governance perspective. So what I did was I narrowed down the region that I was looking at. I didn't look at Africa holistically. I looked at sub-Saharan Africa. And I got criticism for that, and that I have to include the whole of Africa. So that's definitely something that I'll be taking home. So the paper is basically on how many people are actually migrating to Europe. My paper particularly focuses on those migrations that are unsafe, if I may say. So people are using unsafe modes of transport. What are the human rights implications of those migrants in transit? One might also note that there were reports in media on slave trade, modern day slave trade happening in Libya. And those are some of the issues that I touch on, but I do not dwell too much on that because I narrow it down and come down to it's perhaps a governance crisis from the home country of these migrants, a governance crisis at the ports of exit out to Europe and many other parts of the world. And that's pretty much what my focus was on. I recommend that good governance must be promoted. good governance must not only look at processes but also look at deliverables in terms of what are our governments doing for us, the people of the continent, particularly those who come from countries where migration trends are higher as opposed to others. And also the study also just sets the record straight in terms of migration patterns by Africans. Intra-African migration is actually more as compared to outward migration out of the continent. And then I also just reinforce the idea that human rights must always be central in how we judge governance, in how governance is supposed to be conducted. So we're looking at human rights-based governance, and we're also looking at the promotion, the protection, the realization of all human rights, including socio-economic rights, which are usually neglected. The APRM is doing a great job, and I also think that perhaps their mandate it's got potential to be expanded and to be really hands-on in terms of issues of governance. Recommendations from the APRM would be important, especially for those countries that are seen to be lagging behind. I would also maybe think that the APRM must, because when I was on the website, and I stand corrected, it appears as if it deals with countries that have membership to the APRM. And I think every AU member state should have membership to the APRM in that regard. Sustainable development, I like that word because I think it really encompasses a lot of things. And practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders, there really needs to be a continuation of just engagement between these stakeholders. And I also think engagement should also be with the governments, because they are the ones who ultimately execute the good governance. So I think it's an ongoing process, and I believe it's got potential for better prospects and improvement.